Earlier this year, the administration in the United States decided that they were going to close FEMA. So they just decided that they didn't want the agency anymore. They didn't feel like it was going to be important. They didn't like the agency. They felt like it was inefficient and it didn't help people prepare for disasters. For those of you who don't know of it, FEMA stands for the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And there's just so many people who don't understand how FEMA works or what it does. So today I'm going to walk you through what FEMA does and what will happen when FEMA closes. So here's the way it works. First of all, it's really important to understand the emergency management landscape. So the way it works is when an incident happens, the county or city is the first response agency involved in reacting or responding to that disaster. So when a disaster happens, like a flood or an earthquake, so today let's assume it's a flood. So let's assume that there's been a massive storm which resulted in high winds and flooding. Easy enough. So first it'll go to the local jurisdiction, like the city or the county. And so the city or the county will send responders out. They'll send out emergency management. They'll send out the fire department. They'll send out ambulances. They'll send out law enforcement. And they'll do their best along with local sheltering. They'll have the American Red Cross. They'll have other sheltering agencies. They'll have emergency food activated. They'll have emergency food aid agencies who will assist as well, and they will try to contain the response as best they can. However, some disasters get so large or they stretch the resources out where they can't do anything. So they go to the next level, and so they use a tool called the Memorandum of Understanding, which is generally an agreement between a couple of different counties to supply different sorts of resources. So if a county gets overwhelmed by that wind and flooding, they will go to the next county over using agreements that they've put in place. They're trying to draw those additional resources so they don't get overwhelmed. However, once that happens, if it gets even larger, so it's to the point where the county can't handle it, the two counties don't have enough resources, then those counties must formally apply to the state, and the state will then get involved directly. And the states throughout the U.S. will have different kinds of tools and resources that counties just simply don't have. For instance, one time in Louisiana, there was actually a snowstorm in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and I will tell you, I lived there for many years. Not a lot of snowstorms in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. So what they did was they requested resources from actually another state. They actually went to Houston, Texas. They actually went to Texas and requested snowplows from out of states. They went to Oklahoma, they went to Texas, places that traditionally do have snowstorms, and they were able to get those resources in order to respond to it. Once the county gets overwhelmed, however, they will formally apply to the state, and the state has a state emergency management agency. All 50 states have an emergency management agency, and in those, they will then allocate different resources within the state. They have the resources to go to different counties, to be able to draw from those resources, and the state itself will own resources that it can allocate to those areas. A lot of times you'll hear about the National Guard being activated because many states, when the civilians get overwhelmed, they will turn to the National Guard, and the governor will then formally sign a declaration activating the National Guard. They'll do what's called the Declaration of Emergency. They'll activate resources throughout the state, which then they can allocate to those counties to help them deal with the flooding responses. And it doesn't mean they're throwing everything at it. What it means is that they're going to ask the counties, what do you need? They will assess that and then determine the amount of resources so that they're also not sending too many people, because that gets really expensive for states to be able to activate people from other counties. You have to think about transporting them and sheltering them and making sure that you're also paying them and reimbursing them for any supplies or equipment that they may use throughout the response. States sometimes, though, they get overwhelmed, and what they'll try to do in some cases is the states will go to other states and they will try to get them to help. There are also instances in California, for example, when they actually need specialized types of search and rescue teams, and they'll go to other states because sometimes they will have those, and they will be able to deploy them in what's called a compact system. States have what's called an Emergency Management Assistance Compact, and that's called EMAC, but they have other names for them as well because each state works with other states where they develop compacts, which means agreements, where they say, if I have a disaster, I would like to have these resources available, and if you have a disaster, we will make our resources available to you. But then sometimes that's not enough either. You get the Hurricane Katrinas, you get the Hurricane Sandys, you get the Northridge earthquakes, you get really large disasters, even 9/11, where you have to go out of state. You have to go national because there's either A, resources that only the federal government has available to them, B, there are just too many states to have to reach out to try to grab resources from. So FEMA organizes that through what's called a federal coordinating officer. And then FEMA, what they will do is they will look around the country and determine what resources are available that can assist the states, which therefore will assist the county or the city. And they will allocate those resources with the goal in mind to get it back to the states and get it back to the county as quickly as possible, because those resources, again, are very expensive and very hard to allocate. If FEMA is not there, a couple things are going to happen. First of all, states are then going to have to find specialized resources throughout other states. They're going to have to widen their net to try to reach out to different states in advance, develop those relationships in advance, develop those compacts in advance that everybody understands where they need to go if a disaster occurs. Second of all, they need to establish those relationships with the federal government because there are resources that only the federal government has. So, for instance, the U.S. government will have certain kind of specialized military equipment, certain kind of specialized hazardous materials teams. So, for example, if there is a release of a really particularly dangerous chemical, I can tell you there are only certain hazmat teams in the country that can respond to that. If you have an outbreak of a particularly virulent type of plague, there are certain kind of resources. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention actually have predetermined go packs that they just sit in warehouses. They're already packed up and everything. All they have to do is be placed on these large military transport planes, and they can be transported immediately anywhere in the country within 20 hours. They actually will have those supplies on the ground. And in fact, I actually met with one of the coordinating officers. I went to training with one of them one time, and he told me that the packets that he has that are specifically designed for certain kinds of bubonic plagues, they actually can be there on location, depending upon, in the continental United States, they can be there within 12 hours or less, without doubt, because they know how virulent these things can be. So without that, the states would have to do that entirely on their own. In addition, without FEMA there, now you're going to have to determine where you're going to get the money from, because FEMA also supplies money and certain kinds of financial aid. If that coordination isn't there, states will now have to design their own financial frameworks so that people can get the kind of loans that they need in a disaster in order to get out of it. So like what we saw in the Palisades fire, people were immediately applying for federal aid because FEMA was involved almost immediately. A couple of other things. One of the things that is valuable about FEMA is that if an event, and they know this in advance, if we know there's a Category 5 hurricane barreling down on South Florida, FEMA doesn't really have to wait. The states don't have to wait. The states will go to the counties and say, I know a major hurricane is about to come here. I'm going to get you a declaration of emergency now. And then they will go to FEMA. They will formally request what's called a declaration of emergency. And the person who signs that is the governor. Can't be anyone else but the governor. The governor signs that agreement. And if it goes past the state, then the governor will formally apply to the President of the United States requesting a declaration of disaster. It's really important because the declaration of disaster activates all these kinds of resources, the financial resources, the personnel, the actual equipment and supplies, everything, these sort of specialized federal teams. Anything that the state will need are now suddenly available to them. But the president has to sign off on it. If the president does not do that, then those resources can't be made available. And what will happen is that states at that point will have to go to one another and develop sophisticated compacts. And if there is something that we know automatically is going to be a disaster. So, for example, if we have a Category 5 hurricane barreling down on the state of Florida, what will happen is the state and the county will already be in conversation saying they understand an emergency is going to occur. They're not going to wait. They know a Category 5 hurricane is very destructive, and so they're going to go directly to the president and say, we would like a declaration of disaster declared now to save us time, because we know what's going to happen. We know people are going to need money. We know we're going to need these resources. And so that's the only way that they're going to be able to get those resources available. So they go to them very early on. If FEMA didn't exist, the states would need to go to the federal government and they would need to lay out a sophisticated system. How exactly are we going to get the money that we need to provide businesses with loans through the Small Business Administration? How are we going to get immediate money and grants and financial resources to citizens? How are we going to make sure those resources are there? Those frameworks can definitely be developed, and it doesn't mean that FEMA has to exist or doesn't have to exist, but in the end, those arrangements would have to be made prior to the disaster. Also, other agreements would need to be made with the federal government by states to ensure that specialized kinds of teams and resources can instantly be made available when disaster occurs. If FEMA doesn't exist, that doesn't happen, and then they have to go directly to them in order to get the money that they need. One of the other things as well is that grants would not be available. FEMA actually administers a number of these grants through the Department of Homeland Security. Preparedness grants, meaning they're giving money for a particular state to train certain kinds of responders. I actually went to a number of federal facilities when I was younger, and I trained there. I trained at FEMA's Emergency Management Academy. I actually trained at the Emergency Management Institute, which was located in Maryland. I went to the Center for Domestic Preparedness, which is in Anniston, Alabama, and I went to a number of other facilities in New Mexico. I went to one that was outside of Las Vegas. I went to Texas. I actually did a few in Louisiana as well. So I traveled all over. Those were schools that FEMA makes available through the Department of Homeland Security. If FEMA doesn't exist, another federal agency like Department of Homeland Security would have to directly administer those programs to ensure that preparedness grants were administered correctly and that people were getting the right incentives, because certain states are given money in order to mitigate against disasters. So in California, we're given money to, say, thin out the forest to lessen the impact of a wildfire. Or it's given to a big city somewhere to prepare against seismic issues. Or money is given to big cities in order to reinforce buildings against seismic activity. This is common in Los Angeles, or it's done for national security reasons, particularly in places where there are high-value targets. This is also true with major sports stadiums, and these grants would have to be administered by somebody else if FEMA wasn't there. So these things could, as I said, be done, but it would have to be done separately outside of a federal coordinating officer. The answer is there would probably still be a federal coordinating officer, but the responses would look very, very different. So I hope this video today kind of gave you a little bit of an idea about what to expect if FEMA were to be entirely abolished, because in the end, if FEMA does go away, we do have to have some other way of administering these different resources and programs to ensure that disaster management runs smoothly when the public sector, meaning the government, is asked to respond and having to deal with various types of natural, technological, or security emergencies. However, one of the criticisms I have leveled on FEMA is that sometimes what they do is they sometimes create inadvertently a culture of dependency where people say, well, I don't have to worry about it. FEMA will take care of it for me. FEMA will handle it. There have also been accusations that FEMA is politicized because when certain administrations come in, when certain presidents come in from certain parties, certain states, there have been studies I've seen where when certain presidents from certain parties go in, there are states that tend to be more aligned with that president's political party that will get more disaster money. It really just depends. There's a lot of controversy in this. And so as a result of that, there's just been a lot of concern that FEMA's been politicized to the point where it's just not helping people as much. And instead, it's creating a culture of dependence because people don't feel like they need to prepare because someone else is doing it for them. This is Disaster Patrick, and remember, prepare for a disaster, and you'll never experience one.